The aircraft was waiting at the gate at London Heathrow when we arrived. Boarding had already begun. Passengers moved down the jet bridge in a steady flow, dragging carry-ons, adjusting jackets, speaking in low voices meant for late hours. It was a scheduled overnight flight to New York. Full, routine, nothing remarkable on paper. Inside the cabin, everything felt familiar. The faint smell of coffee and recycled air, overhead bins opening and closing, seatbelts clicking into place. A flight attendant helped a couple stow their bags and smiled without effort. People were tired, not anxious. In the cockpit, the checks were uneventful. Fuel was on target. Weather across the Atlantic was clear. No advisories. Our route would take us southwest over open water, passing well south of Bermuda, then straight toward the eastern seaboard. Nothing about it suggested trouble. Pushback was on time. Engines spooled smoothly. The aircraft rolled, paused, then lifted cleanly into the night. London disappeared beneath cloud, and the climb settled into a quiet, mechanical certainty. At cruise altitude, autopilot engaged. Systems stabilized. Another long crossing had begun. Hours passed without incident. The cabin lights dimmed to evening mode. Meals were served and cleared. Most passengers slept or watched movies with the sound low. The aisle lights cast a soft glow over still faces and empty cups. Outside the windows, the Atlantic was invisible. There was only darkness, stars, and the faint reflection of the cabin glass. The moon hung low off the left side of the aircraft, steady and unchanged. We were hundreds of miles from land. Radar was clean. Weather remained clear. It was the kind of flight pilots barely remember afterward. My co-pilot and I talked to stay awake. Nothing important, a schedule change coming up next month, a hotel in New York we both disliked. Something one of our instructors used to say during simulator training. Autopilot flew the plane. We monitored. Routine. I glanced forward through the windshield while my co-pilot was talking. At first, I didn't register anything unusual. Then I noticed a slight shimmer ahead of us, barely visible, like heat haze. I ignored it. At altitude, light does strange things. Thin cloud layers, ice crystals, fatigue. I'd seen similar effects before. I looked back down at the instruments and let the conversation continue. A few moments later, the shimmer returned. It lingered longer this time. Still faint, still explainable, but persistent enough to draw my attention again. I leaned forward slightly and checked the weather radar. It showed nothing. Clear air all the way through. When I looked up again, the distortion hadn't faded. It had grown. The stars behind it appeared subtly misaligned, not missing, just wrong. Their spacing felt off, as if the sky itself had been stretched thin in that region. I stopped speaking. My co-pilot followed my gaze. Neither of us said anything at first. The distortion wasn't dark. It didn't block the sky. Light passed through it, but bent as it did so, making depth difficult to judge. It looked less like an object and more like a flaw, a vertical region where the sky no longer behaved correctly. The moon remained fixed off to the left, unchanged. That was what unsettled me most. It gave the rest of the sky a reference point, something solid to compare against whatever this was. The turbulence light chimed once. The aircraft shifted gently. Somewhere in the cabin, a glass rattled. No panic, no reaction. Everything else remained stable. Engines normal. Altitude steady. Only the heading had drifted a few degrees off course. Not sharply, not suddenly, just enough to notice. I corrected it without disengaging autopilot. My co-pilot kept staring ahead. After a moment, he spoke quietly, without looking at me. He said that this wasn't for us. I asked him what he meant. He didn't answer. What had looked like shimmering air now appeared layered and folded inward, as if a section of the sky had been bent and held in place. The distortion had depth to it now. It wasn't flat. It wasn't empty. It looked like something had pushed through and stopped halfway. I stared at it, waiting for my mind to offer an explanation it could live with. Ice crystals, cloud refraction, anything familiar. Then something moved inside it. At first, I thought it was a trick of light, a brief shift, barely noticeable, like a shadow passing behind glass. I leaned forward without realizing I'd done it, my eyes fixed on the same point. A narrow form began to extend from the distortion. It didn't emerge all at once. It lengthened slowly, as if being tested into our air, translucent and uneven, tapering at the end. It wasn't solid enough to cast a shadow, but it bent the stars behind it as it moved. I felt a tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with altitude. The shape paused, suspended in open sky. It didn't reach toward us. It drifted, curling slightly, changing orientation as if reacting to something we couldn't feel. Then another followed. This one emerged several degrees to the side, thinner, moving differently, as though it had its own intent. For a moment, the two hung there together, adjusting, recoiling, extending again. My brain refused to give them a name. A third form appeared, then a fourth. They came in uneven intervals, not synchronized, not symmetrical. Each one extended cautiously from the distortion, stopping, shifting, curling, as if sampling the space around them. They weren't striking or grabbing. They were searching. I became acutely aware of how fast my heart was beating. Within less than a minute, the sky ahead of us was threaded with them. Numerous forms, overlapping, stretching outward from the rift in slow, deliberate motions. Some drifted farther than others. Some recoiled abruptly, as if encountering resistance. None of them acknowledged the aircraft. That was worse. I realized then that they weren't coming for us. They were feeling the world. The cabin lights flickered. The behavior of the forms changed. What had been slow, searching movement became purposeful. Several of the tentacle-like shapes extended farther than before, their motion no longer tentative. They angled toward the aircraft, adjusting as we moved, as if tracking us. One of them passed through the space just ahead of the nose. There was no impact and no visible resistance, but the aircraft reacted instantly. A sudden vibration rolled through the cockpit, deep and internal, followed by a sharp chime as multiple systems registered disagreement. The sound wasn't from the engines. It felt like the airframe itself had begun to hum. Another form swept across the left side of the aircraft. It phased through the fuselage without tearing metal or leaving marks, but the contact was unmistakable. The controls shuddered in my hands, and the aircraft jolted hard enough to send a ripple through the cabin. The seatbelt sign snapped on automatically, followed by the dull thud of overhead bins shifting and voices rising behind us. The turbulence warning chimed again. In the cockpit, alerts began to stack. Not failures, but warnings, discrepancies, lag. The beeping grew faster, sharper, overlapping in a way that made it difficult to separate one from another. The aircraft began to drift. Not yawing or rolling, but sliding, pulled subtly toward the distortion ahead. Autopilot failed to correct it. Manual input responded with delay, as though the plane were moving through something thicker than air. More of the tentacles passed through us. Some flickered as they did, phasing in and out of visibility, never fully solid, never fully absent. Each contact brought another shudder, another spike of vibration, another burst of confused alerts. In the cabin, passengers felt only turbulence, sharp, irregular, unnatural. The kind that makes people grip armrests and stop talking. Most of them never saw what was ahead. At this angle, the rift remained nearly invisible from the windows. A few passengers may have noticed the stars bending strangely, or the moon sliding sideways, but nothing clear enough to understand. What they felt instead was the plane being handled by something they couldn't see. I called air traffic control, no response. I tried again, louder, my voice clipped now. Still nothing. No static, no carrier tone, no indication that the transmission had gone anywhere. The pull intensified. The humming deepened, vibrating through the controls and into my arms. Loose objects in the cockpit trembled. The moon shifted further in the left window, confirming what the instruments were slow to admit. We were being drawn toward it. I declared a mayday. Once, then again. The word echoed uselessly in the cockpit. The radios remained dead. Then, without warning, the tension changed. Several of the tentacles tightened suddenly, their movements no longer exploratory but strained. They stiffened, stretching backward into the rift as if something on the other side was pulling them away from us. The pull on the aircraft wavered, then weakened. Control returned in fragments. The vibration softened, the humming faltered. The aircraft resisted the drift, sluggishly at first, then more decisively. Ahead of us, the rift began to collapse. Its edges folded inward unevenly, as though the opening were being forced shut. The tentacles reacted immediately. They pressed back toward the distortion, stretching thinner and longer, attempting to keep the tear open as it shrank around them. For a brief moment, it looked as if they might succeed. Then, one by one, they slipped free. Not pulled away gently, but losing their hold as the space they emerged from continued to close. Each form recoiled sharply, snapping back into the shrinking tear. A final few lingered longer than the rest, straining, flickering, thinning until there was no room left for them to remain. When the last of them withdrew, the rift sealed completely. There was no sound and no light, only empty sky. The pull vanished all at once. The aircraft lurched, then stabilized. The humming faded from the fuselage, replaced by a silence that felt too sudden, too complete. The cabin lights returned slowly. Passengers looked around in shock, unsure what they had just experienced. Some laughed nervously, already searching for normal explanations. Others sat rigid in their seats, breathing shallowly, hands locked around armrests. The turbulence light went dark. The seatbelt sign remained on for several seconds longer, then switched off. The aircraft corrected its heading without input. Several minutes passed before the radios came back to life. When air traffic control responded, the voice was calm and steady, as expected. I reported the event as accurately as possible. A visual anomaly ahead of the aircraft. A localized distortion. Uncommanded lateral pull consistent with a gravitational effect. There was a brief pause. They stated that there was nothing on radar. No traffic, no weather systems, no atmospheric disturbances recorded in our sector. Based on available data, they said, the event aligned with a transient weather-related or optical phenomenon. The phrasing was precise, final. I pressed once more, careful with my words. I repeated that the aircraft had been pulled sideways and that control inputs had lagged. I said that multiple systems had registered disagreement at the same time. Another pause followed. When they spoke again, their response did not change. They repeated that there was no indication of an external object or anomaly in the airspace. They advised us to continue on present course and to report if any further irregularities were observed. That was all they offered. They did not ask what the distortion looked like. They did not ask about the shapes. They did not ask how long the pull had lasted, only whether it happened again. We acknowledged and continued in silence. At the time, I assumed they were dismissing us. I understand now they weren't. They already knew. We landed at JFK just before dawn. As we taxied toward the gate, I noticed several black SUVs parked on the far edge of the tarmac, engines idling, lights off. They were positioned away from the terminal, close enough to see but not close enough to draw attention. At the time, I told myself they were unrelated. The doors opened and passengers began to deboard as usual. Flight attendants kept their voices calm, movements deliberate. Most people looked exhausted more than shaken, eager to get off the plane and put the night behind them. Some didn't make it far. A few passengers were quietly pulled aside at the end of the jet bridge. No uniforms, no raised voices. Just brief conversations that ended with them being guided away from the terminal flow. Others were allowed to leave without interruption, unaware anything unusual had happened at all. My co-pilot and I were not given that option. We were escorted down the stairs to the tarmac instead of into the terminal. Up close, the SUVs were unmarked, windows dark, interiors impossible to see. No one introduced themselves. They already had our names. The aircraft was sealed off behind us. Maintenance crews moved in quickly, working under the supervision of people who were not part of the airline. They focused on a specific section of the fuselage along the left side, just forward of the wing. There, they found a residue clinging unevenly to the skin of the plane. It was translucent and slightly viscous, like something between oil and gel. It had no odor. Under the floodlights, it reacted slowly, thinning at the edges as if it were breaking down on its own. Photographs were taken. Samples were collected into sealed containers. Even as they worked, the substance continued to degrade, losing cohesion, fading until only faint streaks remained. By the time the aircraft was towed away, most of it was already gone. The plane was quarantined. It was moved to a remote hangar and cleaned under controlled conditions. No passengers were allowed near it. No crew returned on board. By the end of the day, there was nothing left to see. The questioning began immediately. My co-pilot and I were separated and interviewed individually. The rooms were plain and windowless. The questions were precise, repetitive, and entirely emotionless. What did you see? When did you first notice it? How did it move? Did anything make physical contact with the aircraft? They asked about pressure sensations, about sound loss, about disorientation, about whether we felt as if the aircraft had been pulled rather than pushed. They already knew what answers they were expecting. Several passengers were questioned as well, selected for reasons that were never explained. Those seated near the left side, those who reported unusual sensations, those who hesitated when asked if the turbulence felt normal. No explanations were offered to any of us. When I asked who they represented, the answer was brief and dismissive. It wasn't relevant. When I asked what the substance on the aircraft was, the question was ignored entirely. The interviews ended as abruptly as they began. We were released without paperwork, without instructions, and without any acknowledgement that the event had occurred at all. No one told us what to say or what not to say. They didn't need to. By the time we were allowed to leave the aircraft was already gone, moved out of sight to somewhere we were not permitted to follow. That was the last direct contact I had with anyone connected to that night. By the time the aircraft was cleared for service, there was nothing left to document. The residue recorded during the initial inspection no longer existed. The fuselage showed no damage, no discoloration, and no measurable anomaly. Maintenance logs reflected routine inspection and cleaning only. Passenger accounts describing sideways motion, pressure behind the eyes, sound loss, or disorientation were absent from the final record. System discrepancies were attributed to transient electrical fluctuations. The incident was formally classified as moderate turbulence associated with atmospheric conditions. No further action was recommended. That classification did not change. I still check the sky when I fly at night. Not because I expect to see it again, but because I know we were lucky last time. I plan to keep flying for a few more years, long enough to finish my pension, long enough to make sure my family is taken care of. I do the math every time I accept a roster. After that, I'm done. Because if it happens again, we won't be lucky next time.